I'm Walter Bosley, co-author with Todd Wood of The Mystery of Ingersoll Lockwood, Volume 1 of the Lost Future series. Available print on demand only at lulu.com. Chapter 3. If we are to look for a first likely suspect for someone in Lockwood's life who may have been feeding him special knowledge, especially about the future, we ought to consider the illustrator of the book Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. Charles Howard Johnson was born in 1867 or 68. No one is certain. He may have been born in Kansas City, but no one is certain. He was believed to have studied art for 1 year in Cincinnati, Ohio, but again, that's simply what he said. The one thing that seems to be corroborated by those who did know him is that he arrived in New York in 1889 and was soon employed by various magazines and publishers. Johnson's illustrations appear in Life magazine, Truth magazine, and Munsey's magazine. He illustrated 10 books. Respected by his colleagues, Johnson remained a mystery to them. Though he was married and had a daughter, his wife died in 1894, and we couldn't find anything about the child after Johnson's death. He was engaged to the actress Elida Proctor Otis when he died of brain fever on the 3rd of July, 1896. In his obituary, it is mentioned that no colleagues ever verified Johnson having studied art. You can find a modest assortment of Johnson's illustrations in a search online, but not much else. As regards being from Kansas, Johnson claimed that his father had operated a grain elevator in Atchison, but there was no luck in confirming this. Neither could we find a grave site for Johnson. The man appears to be a true mystery, and it makes his uncanny likeness of the character Baron Trump to former President Trump's son, Baron, all the more curious and ripe for speculation. One must consider whether Johnson's work provides any clues. Two stand out, in our opinion, his Lady of Shalott and the 1894 illustrated edition of Longfellow's Evangeline, and that's where things get even more weird. Let's again refer to Jules Verne, who famously inspired, if not saw, the future. Verne also wrote about the Rennes-le-Château mystery. It's well known that the Three Shepherds painting by Poussin, commonly associated with a phrase in the image Et in Arcadia ego, is linked to the Rennes mystery. Arcadia became associated with North America, specifically a portion of eastern Canada and New England, mostly Maine. The Arcadians were French settlers and were ultimately forced to migrate by the British masters of Canada. They ended up all the way down south in Louisiana and the surrounding territory, mixing with native cultures and becoming known as Cajuns. Many Bonapartist refugees who fled France after Waterloo settled in Louisiana, suggesting that perhaps the Napoleon mysteries might also fit into this picture. Author Bosley proposes in his book Secret Missions 4, The Esoteric Napoleon, that the Emperor was adept at psychic arts and deeply immersed in esoteric secrets. That idea is right in line with the topic of this book, especially with the French connection via the artist Nicolas Poussin, Rennes-le-Château, and Arcadia, the setting of the story Evangeline. A descendant of Poussin was an officer serving under Napoleon, and he came to America after Waterloo. Additionally, a relative of Madame de Hautpoul, at the heart of the Rennes mystery, was also an officer serving Napoleon. All this association between Napoleon, Poussin, Rennes-le-Château, and Arcadia casts even more interesting light on the fact that our enigmatic Charles Howard Johnson illustrated an edition of Longfellow's Evangeline, the literary saga most associated with Arcadians. How so? Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's tomb has similarities to the tomb depicted in Poussin's works associated with the Three Shepherds. Upon examination of the Poussin and Longfellow works, one might come away with a suggestion that both the artist and the poet, centuries apart, understood some arcane association linking death to a metaphysical aspect of the time-space continuum, perhaps even self-controlled reincarnation. Thus we ask the question, Did Johnson, as illustrator of an Evangeline edition, know something about this? Charles Howard Johnson's illustration of Baron Trump in the late 19th century book by Lockwood looks startlingly like present-day Baron Trump at the time of his father's election in the 21st century. Johnson illustrated the character over 100 years before the birth of the president's son. Could this be more than coincidence? Or did Johnson see the future? A preposterous question, you might say, but are we the first to ask it? Obviously not. That question is why the book came to the public awareness in 2016. But someone else may have had similar suspicions about Johnson 70 years ago, long before the president's son was ever imagined. Jack Finney is considered one of the great science fiction writers of his era. Along with the classic Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Finney is best known for his time travel stories, specifically The Third Level and Time and Again. You can look these books up, and we recommend them highly, but we don't belabor the details of these stories here. Rather, we'll present the pertinent points. The Third Level was published in 1950 and is about a man who heads home via the subway in New York City and finds himself on the third level at Grand Central Station, a level that most people don't remember was there. The man has slipped back in time to 1894, the year Charles Howard Johnson's wife died. The man in Finney's story is named Charlie. In 1970, Finney's novel Time and Again was published. The story takes place in 1882 Manhattan, a mere 7 years before the time we are told Johnson went to New York City. So little is known about Johnson. Might he have been there in 1882? That would be intriguing. In Finney's novel, the now historic Dakota Building serves as the portal through which the protagonist can travel back and forth through time. In 1896, after those 10 days of brain fever, Johnson died, we are told, in his apartment at the Union Square Hotel, the last we hear of him. No graveside could be found at the time of this writing. Did Johnson escape through time rather than die, as Finney's protagonist moved through time via his residence? As delightful as that might be, we can't take Finney's novel as confirmation of bias. Where Time and Again is concerned, we are willing to suggest that Johnson's curious story and the Lockwood book by association inspired Finney. Thus we are back to the question, how did it happen that Lockwood's book and Johnson's illustrations for it are so prescient where President Trump's son is concerned? Just as Finney could have been inspired by learning about Johnson through a familiarity with the Lockwood books, the Lockwood books might have been part of the Trump family library. Donald Trump could have been exposed to the Baron Trump books in his childhood and thought it would be fun to name his youngest son Baron. It really could be that simple, though that doesn't explain the likeness of his son to the illustration of the character in a book over 100 years old. It's that single point that makes Johnson's curiously vacant biography intriguing. But there is also Lockwood's book, 1900 or The Last President, which features angry anarchist mobs terrorizing the Manhattan address of the U.S. president. Is it merely coincidence that such a scenario is essentially identical to real life 120 years after the novel takes place? Even right down to the address of the hotel book, not too far from Trump Tower? And don't forget that Baron Trump's marvelous underground journey takes place mostly in Russia, another major theme in Trump's presidency. Was Lockwood divining the future either in a direct or even indirect manner? How might he have done that? There are suggestive possibilities. First, Lockwood could have seen through future through some esoteric technology or a mystic process. Another possibility is that Lockwood might have had visions or dreams which could explain the differences between his books and the relative details of Trump today, i.e. the murky filter of the subconscious. Another possibility is that Johnson is the one who knew, so to speak, or saw the future and shared the information with Lockwood. Or it's truly all just coincidence. But that's no fun, and still doesn't sufficiently satisfy the needling questions in the back of one's mind. So let's, for the sake of brainstorming, engage in some speculation. Here we go. Chapter 4. Because of the mystery surrounding the missing details in the life of Charles Howard Johnson, we will start this chapter with him, specifically his works of art, to determine if there might be any clues to divination of the future. We will certainly get to such possibilities where Lockwood himself is concerned. In Johnson's Lady of Shalott, there is the cracked mirror. This crack runs diagonally from a southwest to northeast, or vice versa if you prefer, direction. Mirrors have often factored into fantasy tales, being used to see across time or space, to see into other dimensions, to communicate with beings from other planes, and even to physically step through into alternate dimensions or time. In Tennyson's poem, the lady lives isolated in a tower and sees the outside world only by its reflection in a mirror. Is this a clue from Johnson through his painting? Reflective surfaces are a known element of certain divination methods. Was Johnson, or even Lockwood and Johnson, using a mirror to look into the future? Might the crack in the mirror represent some specific issue, either in particular method or an unexpected result of such practices? The crack in the mirror could represent some error in the process which resulted in unexpected bad luck or even tragedy. Lockwood's pertinent Baron Trump book came out in 1893, the year prior to Johnson's wife's death. If the artist and the author had played with arcane magic, could Johnson have interpreted his wife's death as some sort of spiritual punishment or price paid? If a mirror was used in accordance with esoteric technology, we must consider what that technology might have been. That brings us to the looking glass concept, if we're going with a proposed technology as opposed to a purely mystical method. Does a mirror have anything to do with looking glass technology and seeing through time? There is Project Looking Glass, which is being chattered about in that community dedicated to the letter, and on infotainment sources like Edge of Wonder. This project alleges to have developed from captured ET technology. However, strike three on this is that the origin of the claim is reportedly Bob Lazar, and since he has zero credibility with us, we can eliminate this looking glass from consideration. Likewise with claims and antics of the once popular, yet seriously dubious, whistleblower SSP time-jumping commando ranks, which include Basiago, Good, Rice, Smith, and the others. There is the story which co-author Bosley has shared in the past about a pair of non-optical spectacles which were supposedly found among ancient relics discovered deep within Carlsbad caverns, said spectacles allegedly containing thin wires in the lenses which recorded observations made of the past. However, this is admittedly nothing but a story he was told, albeit by an intelligence community source who proved trustworthy in other instances. One might consider the chronovisor of exorcist priest Father Pellegrino Ernetti. This was a spherical contraption, much like a bathysphere, which the priest claimed took him back to view the loaves and fishes miracle, among other events in the life of Jesus Christ, backed up by a photo of what is clearly a devotional statue of the modern era. In other words, just as Ernetti later confessed, the story was a lie. The chronovisor did not work. Conveniently, a half-century prior to Ernetti and his chronovisor, another man allegedly built a so-called camera of past events, or so he claimed in the 1950s, the same decade that Ernetti claimed initially to have built and used his chronovisor. In an extraordinary coincidence, this man, Baird T. Spalding, also alleged to have viewed Jesus Christ, his experience being the Sermon on the Mount. Spalding claimed to have been born in 1857 and having lived in India. But alas, when pressed by would-be followers on a tour of India years later, he angrily refused to show them places that he claimed to have resided in, and his story fell apart after his death nearly 20 years later. Spalding was actually a broke fraud and had been born in 1904. It appears that rumors and claims of devices that allow someone to witness the past by seeing across time have been with us fairly consistently since devices have become a common reality in everyday life. Spectacles, cameras, chronovisors, and reverse-engineered time-traveling ET UFO technology, as an offshoot of aerospace technology which can be included in devices that we are used to, and have taken over from the crystal balls and scrying pools of more superstitious, less technological times. Does that mean there have never been real attempts at looking through time? Who knows? We hear that the legendary Nazi bell affected time when activated. Co-author Bosley and art collector-publisher Stephen Romano have demonstrated that the bell was apparently developed in a rudimentary model in the 1850s by the mysterious German immigrant Sonora Aero Club, almost 80 years before the Nazis. The interesting connection here is that Ingersoll Lockwood spent a few years in Germany as a U.S. consul to the Kingdom of Hanover during the 1860s. The German thread running from the immigrants of the Sonora Aero Club to the Nazi bell runs through the subject of this book. Therefore, we must give consideration to the possibility that Lockwood may have learned of time-looking technology while abroad. Let us return to Johnson first, since he is an even bigger mystery than Lockwood. Nothing is known about Johnson prior to his arriving in New York that he didn't tell people himself. There may indeed be a grave site somewhere, but we haven't found it yet. The obvious question we are posing is whether or not Charles Howard Johnson was a time traveler, or at the very least, introduced Lockwood to looking through time, the past or the future. The problem is the potentially preposterous nature of the question. But let's ask it anyway for the fun of it. Since the idea of time travel or time viewing technology usually ends in fraud or hoax, let's consider another possibility. Consciousness-driven time travel like that in the works of Jack Finney. In the previously discussed stories of Finney, his time travelers step through a veil, or they induce the shifting of the physical body via a mental process. The veil method suggests that different eras coexist in adjacent spaces, and in certain locales the veil separating times and spaces is thinner than usual. No technology is necessary, and for that matter, neither is a mental process. Perhaps Johnson knows where those are located in New York, making his past in Kansas and Cincinnati merely expeditious lies. So where did Johnson come from? For the purpose of this discussion, let's say he came from New York. Of the future, rather. Of our times. That would mean Johnson knew of Trump and of his son Barron, and thus would explain the likeness of the illustrations in the 1893 book. That might also suggest that Johnson told Lockwood enough about Donald Trump, his presidency, and the triggered Americans to provide resonant elements of the books. Johnson may also have not been forthcoming about his time travel and merely hinted certain facts to Lockwood. If Lockwood had been told about time travel by Johnson or anyone else, why would he have written books with only suggestions of association to the future? We suspect that Lockwood wouldn't have written about an underground journey. He would more likely have written about a journey through time and space. This suggests to us that Johnson would not likely have told Lockwood his secret, only conveyed a minimal amount of info about Trump, enough to inspire the author. But in what context? What might Lockwood and Johnson have been discussing that would lead to Johnson sharing any information about the president and his son a century in the future? Why would it lead to an underground journey tale? The novel about turmoil during an election year makes sense when you see it from our perspective today. The Hollow Earth theme of the Barron Trump tale, on the other hand, was likely inspired by such theories popular in the 19th century, unless Lockwood knew something actual about said theories and was trying to reveal it in a cloak of fantastic fiction. That's an idea we'll discuss later. Let's return to Johnson and how he may have traveled through time, for the simple pleasure of the discussion, of course. In the novel Finney wrote 20 years after the third level, the protagonist journeys through time using a mental process using his consciousness. Yes, he does first occupy a physical space which existed in the time he chooses to travel to, which is important, but it's through his consciousness that he accomplishes the feat. This is much the same method used by another character in a novel by Richard Matheson, Somewhere in Time. In Matheson's novel, which was published a few years after Finney's Time and Again, the protagonist wills himself back to 1896 using a process virtually identical to that of Finney's character. He dresses in the clothing of the target era, complete with currency of the time, and conducts his experiment in a place which existed in the target year. Clearly, Finney influenced Matheson, but there is another interesting point. Matheson's character goes back in time the same year Johnson died. And at the end of Matheson's novel, his protagonist dies shortly after being yanked back to his own time, having literally disappeared from the Divination of 1896. Could this be why we haven't found a gravesite for Johnson? Did he actually return to his own time and not actually die while in New York in 1896? It should be noted that the film version of Matheson's novel has some differences from the original story. In the book, the protagonist has learned in the beginning that he's dying. In the film, he dies of a broken heart, withers away by giving up his will to live apart from the woman of 1896 with whom he fell in love. That woman is an actress, by the way. Interesting that Johnson was engaged to an actress when he reportedly died in 1896. Matheson wrote the screenplay for the film, so what compelled him to make the changes between the book and the movie? Mere drama? This inspires another question. With the similarities in time travel method in separate works by Finney and Matheson, and the coincidence of the year and the actress' love interest in Somewhere in Time with Johnson's life, is it possible that Finney and Matheson, who were contemporaries, were acquainted with Johnson's story or even the man himself? That wild speculation makes one wonder what Finney and Matheson learned from Johnson about time travel. Was Johnson using the consciousness method used by both authors? Did they get the idea from him? It's interesting that Finney's time traveler is part of a classified military program training operatives in consciousness-driven time travel. Was Johnson part of such a program? Not long after Finney's novel was published, the U.S. Army started its now legendary remote viewing program, a practice which we are told has been used to see across time and space. Was Charles Howard Johnson such an operative? Then there is Matheson's vision of the film, adapted from his novel, Somewhere in Time, different from the book in that it displays a numerology which reflects a deeper stream in the subtext, a subtext chock full of Egyptian symbolism, including that of death. Herein is where we come to a curious association between death and time and the mystery of Arcadia discussed earlier. Charles Howard Johnson illustrated an edition of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Evangeline, a romantic tragedy against the backdrop of the forced emigration of Arcadians. But neither Finney nor Matheson were the first to use consciousness-driven time travel. Mary Griffith wrote a story, 300 Years Hence, it was titled, about a man who journeys through time while he sleeps, waking up in a futuristic New York City. Her story was published in 1836. Thus Johnson could have read it. Similar in plot is H.G. Wells's The Sleeper Wakes, but this was not published until 3 years after Johnson reportedly died. How delightful it might be if Wells got his story from Johnson. We mustn't disregard Mary Griffith, though, for she was quite an interesting woman. Born in 1772, the daughter of a Frenchman who came to America in 1776, when Mary became widowed, she focused all her attention on scientific experimentation and study. She was published in the science and literary journals of her day. Mary was keenly interested in earth sciences, natural history, epidemiology, optics, and vision. It so happens that Mary Griffith had papers published with the help of the Wharton Company, the same Wharton Company who founded the Wharton School, where Donald Trump attended college. It may be no accident nor mere job for hire that led the mysterious illustrator Johnson to the bizarre territory of Nicolas Poisson, Rennes-le-Château, and the dynamic landscapes available to human consciousness in the time-space continuum. Let's go with this. The Mystery of Ingersoll Lockwood, Volume 1 of the Lost Future series, by Todd Wood with Walter Bosley, is available print on demand only at lulu.com.